Hello everyone. I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story.
Story 1. They say national parks are protected land, but from what? No one ever asks. Ranger Tom Adler had been assigned to Coldwater National Preserve for over a decade. Located deep in the Appalachian backwoods, the preserve wasn't open to the public. There were no trails, no welcome center, no guided hikes. Just forest. Miles and miles of thick pine woods, moss-covered ravines, and silence so deep it rang in your ears. Tom had asked about that once, when he first took the job. His supervisor, a crusty man with skin like leather and eyes like wet stones, simply said, "We keep an eye on it." No elaboration. Most days, Tom patrolled the boundaries, checked the seismic stations, replaced worn-out trail cams, and read books in his ranger tower. The only road in was gravel, and it ended a mile past the main cabin. Visitors were rare, usually lost or stubborn hikers ignoring the do not enter signs. They never stayed long. Not because Tom turned them away. It was the woods. Something about them got under your skin. Sometimes Tom would find gear left behind, backpacks, expensive tents, cameras still recording, but never any people. His reports always said the same: lost hikers, presumed turned around, no evidence of foul play. After a while, it stopped bothering him, until the night he found the girl. She was maybe 16, thin, barefoot, wearing a hospital gown dirty with pine needles. She came stumbling out of the trees near the eastern ridge, eyes wide like a deer's, skin the color of old paper. Tom wrapped her in a thermal blanket, gave her water, called it in. But the girl wouldn't speak, just stared at the tree line, lips quivering, shaking her head over and over. The paramedics took her away, and Tom filled out another report. When he called to follow up the next day, the hospital told him no such girl had been admitted. There was no record, no dispatch. When he checked the footage from his dash cam, the part with the girl was corrupted, just digital static. He tried to let it go. Probably just stress. Forests do strange things to the mind. But then came the noises. It began at night. Clicking sounds beneath the tower. Not animals, more like teeth chattering in rhythm. Sometimes scratching, faint but deliberate. Sometimes something heavier, dragging. Tom stayed up late with his rifle across his lap, spotlight scanning the trees. Nothing. Then the dream started. He was in the woods, but not like he knew them. The trees were dead, blackened like charcoal, and the ground was soaked in something thick. He could hear voices, low and distant, speaking in a language that crawled up his spine like centipedes. And there was something else, the sense of being watched from behind his eyes, as if something inside him was looking out. He started finding the sigils next. Carved into trees, etched into stone. Circles with jagged symbols that hurt to look at too long. One morning, a raven was impaled on a branch outside his door, its beak pried open, something like a thorny root wriggling inside its throat. Tom burned it and didn't write the incident down. He tried to leave. He packed up his gear, started driving the gravel road. After 10 minutes, he realized he'd been driving in circles, the same rock, the same fallen log. His GPS spun uselessly. His compass pointed west no matter how he turned. The woods weren't letting him go. For the first time in his career, Tom radioed for a chopper evac. Static. No response. He climbed the tower and tried the satellite phone. Nothing. The sky above was blue and calm, but something in the forest was moving closer now. The trees seemed to lean in when he looked away, and he could swear he saw shapes moving between them. Pale limbs, too long. Faces, but not human ones. He stayed in the tower. Didn't sleep. Ate canned beans and sipped water slowly. The sun rose and fell like it was on fast forward. He began hearing voices outside, sometimes calling his name, sometimes sounding like his own voice, pleading to be let in. One night, the girl came back. She stood at the base of the tower, staring up at him. Her mouth was open too wide, jaw hanging like it was broken, and something inside her chest pulsed like a heartbeat, but outside her skin. Tom raised his rifle. She didn't move, just whispered, "They're in the roots." Over and over. Then she dropped to the ground and began to dig, with her hands frantically. The soil pulled back for her like water, revealing a tunnel beneath the tower, a spiral path, old stone steps leading down into the dark. Tom didn't remember going down. 1 minute he was watching, the next he was inside it. The walls were moist, covered in lichen and strange symbols that moved when he blinked. The air was thick, and beneath it, the clicking sounds grew louder. The path opened into a vast underground chamber. Roots hung from the ceiling like chandeliers, some dripping with black ichor. And in the center was a tree, an enormous, pulsating tree with bark like flesh and branches that twitched. It had no leaves, only eyes. Dozens of them, opening and closing in slow rhythm. Around it stood people, or what had once been people. Rangers, maybe. Park staff. Bones in uniforms. Their mouths sewn shut, their hands fused into the roots. They were alive, breathing, watching. The tree spoke not with words, but with thought. It pressed into Tom's mind, uncoiling like a serpent. It showed him memories that weren't his, rituals in ancient forests, sacrifices made to keep balance, the blood of trespassers feeding the land. Cold water wasn't a preserve. It was a prison. The forest kept something old asleep, but something had changed. A breach, a forgotten ritual. Something was waking. Tom screamed. He ran, but there was no exit. The roots followed him, coiling, wrapping. He felt them pierce his skin, not painfully, more like a warm embrace. The forest welcomed him, took him in. He was part of it now. When the next ranger arrived, months later, assigned to take over the isolated post, he found the tower empty, the logs blank after a certain date. The radios worked fine. The weather was calm. But the forest felt wrong. That night, as he sat alone, he thought he saw someone watching from the tree line. A tall man in a ranger's uniform, eyes black as oil, mouth stitched closed, standing perfectly still beneath the swaying pines. The wind whispered something unintelligible, and the trees began to lean in again. Story 2. When Ranger Daniel Knox transferred to the Northbridge Wilderness, he thought he'd found paradise. Miles of untamed forest, alpine lakes clear as glass, trails barely touched by boots, and the nearest town 2 hours away. This was the dream assignment. Quiet, solitary, serene. That's what the files said. But files don't breathe. Files don't whisper. It began his second week on duty. He found a boot. Just one. Left neatly in the center of Alder Trail. Laces tied. No scuffs. No signs of a struggle. He laughed about it. Made a note. Tagged it. Logged it. Standard protocol. That same night, he heard the voice on the radio. It was garbled, high-pitched, and rhythmic. Static, then a whisper. He's not alone. Daniel tried to call dispatch. Dead air. He shrugged it off as atmospheric interference. The next day, he found another boot, matching the first, 3 miles deeper in. Same trail, same condition. No prints, no wildlife signs nearby. Just pristine silence and that strange sense of watching eyes. By the fourth week, his dog Duke refused to leave the cabin. Ears back, tail down, eyes locked on the woods. Daniel tried coaxing him. Nothing worked. The trees were darker now, somehow, like they were soaking in more shadow than they cast. Even at noon, the light came down dim and sickly. Birds went silent. Chipmunks vanished. Not a single squirrel dared the feeder anymore, but he stopped sleeping. The dreams came every night. He'd walk through the trees, deeper than he'd ever gone. The forest shifting and twisting, trunks opening like mouths, whispering in languages he didn't understand. A tree bleeding black sap, with bones jutting from its roots. A woman's voice singing lullabies in reverse. Every night, he'd wake up with soil under his nails. Week 6, a hiker stumbled into his station. Eyes wide, face scratched, bare feet bleeding. She didn't speak, only drew symbols into the dust with shaking fingers, circles with slashes, spirals that spun too tightly. She clutched Daniel's wrist and said, "Don't look for them. They're already inside." Before he could respond, she screamed, collapsed, and went limp. Paramedics were dispatched. Daniel gave his statement. When they came, she was gone. Not dead, gone. No prints, no drag marks, no blood. Just the same symbols carved into the pine outside the station. Deep, still fresh that he started hearing them during patrols. Voices mimicking animals. Owls calling in triplets, bears huffing like men, frogs croaking his name. He saw movement at the edges, legs too thin, arms too long, heads turning in a full circle. When he radioed for backup, all he heard was his own voice, seconds delayed, repeating his words in monotone. One night, the station lights flickered and died. The generator was full, the fuses untouched. Then came the knocking. Not on the door, on the windows. All of them, at once, tapping in rhythm. Morse code, he thought, but wrong. The taps grew faster, then stopped. In the silence, Duke howled, a low, mournful sound he'd never made before, and vanished into the dark. Daniel chased him for hours, yelling until his throat bled. He found a collar, ripped open like it had exploded. No blood, just that same damned spiral drawn in the dirt beside it. He didn't file a report. He didn't write in the log anymore. What would he say? Dog exploded, forest haunted, dreams chewing on my sanity. He stopped calling in altogether. The park felt like a sealed dome, keeping everything in or out. Then came the call. His radio, silent for days, crackled to life. One word, Northbridge. Then laughter, wet and thick. He turned it off. The tower lights flickered again. Something moved outside that he locked himself in the cabin. Sat with his back to the wall, rifle across his knees. The forest was pressing in. Literally. Tree roots had cracked the concrete outside. Moss grew inside the window frames. Bugs skittered in patterns. Ants moved in spirals. Everything moved in spirals now. The next morning, he went to the old ranger post from the 80s, deeper in the woods, abandoned for decades. The door was open. Inside, dust lay thick on everything except the floor, which was bare, as if swept. The same symbols were drawn across the walls, this time in what looked like claw marks. There were pictures, old rangers, all with eyes scratched out. One photo showed a man who looked like Daniel. Same eyes, same chin, dated 1983. The file said the man disappeared during a solo patrol, lost to the woods. Presumed dead, but Daniel knew. The forest didn't take you. It made you part of it. On the last night, he heard voices in the chimney. Not wind, voices. Chanting low, then screaming. The fireplace bled sap. Or something like sap. Black and hot. The walls pulsed. He couldn't breathe. The ground vibrated. Outside, the trees were moving. Literally walking, dragging themselves on tangled root feet. Bending low to peer through windows that he ran. Into the woods. Into the spiral. He saw things. People folded into the bark, their mouths stretched into knots. Faces peeking from leaves. Something enormous in the canopy, shifting between the stars. He ran until he reached the heart of the forest. A clearing. There, the trees formed a perfect circle. Inside it, a stone altar and Duke. Whole. Sitting calmly, tail wagging. Daniel stepped forward, and that's when the trees closed behind him, and oh, one knows what happened to Daniel Knox. The log stopped. The GPS beacon turned off. When they sent a replacement 6 months later, the cabin was empty. The bed made. Boots by the door. A spiral drawn into the frost on the window. And from the tree line, a figure watched. Tall. Still. Wearing a ranger's uniform. Waiting. Story 3. When Ranger Ellis took the off-season assignment at Black Hollow Reserve, he wasn't looking for excitement. After 10 years patrolling the Smokies and 2 broken fingers from a drunk camper incident, a winter post in a remote stretch of northwestern forest sounded like peace. Black Hollow was an old-growth forest, mostly untouched, closed to the public November through March due to dangerous weather conditions. For 5 months, it would be just him. A satellite radio, supply drops every 2 weeks in the wilderness. That was the agreement. That was the plan. The first 3 weeks were uneventful. Bitter wind cut through the trees at night, but inside the ranger station the fire held steady. The snow made everything quiet, but peaceful, the kind of silence that feels earned. Ellis hiked the perimeter, checked for damage, read thick paperbacks by lantern light. He hadn't spoken to anyone in 17 days, not since the supply team had dropped off canned food in Salt Licks by helicopter. He liked the quiet, but he also noticed something strange on the 7th patrol. One of the metal Salt Licks had been torn open, not chewed or clawed, but peeled like a can of sardines. There were no tracks in the snow around it. None, not even his. He stared at that for a long time. On the 22nd day, he heard the knocking. It was past midnight. Windless. No animals. Just 3 soft, slow knocks at the front door. Not urgent. Not heavy. Just waiting. Ellis, still groggy from sleep, grabbed his sidearm and stepped into his boots. He opened the door fast, flashlight raised. N01. No tracks in the snow. He stood for a while, light sweeping across the white silence. The only thing there was the tree line, dark and sharp as teeth. He shut the door, went back to sleep, dreamed of hollow trees and long, thin arms pulling themselves through the snow without leaving a trail. The next day, Ellis checked the camera logs. Motion-activated wildlife cams were scattered around the reserve perimeter. Most showed nothing, just shifting snow, falling branches, sometimes a deer. But camera 9B by the ridge trail showed something else. A frame of static. Then, a tall figure, blurry and gray, standing just beyond the trees. It didn't move. It was there for 3 frames, then gone. Ellis replayed the footage over and over. No explanation. No footsteps. He reported it to Central Dispatch. They told him it was probably a camera malfunction. 2 days later, he found the snow had melted in a perfect circle around one of the supply caches, about 10 feet wide. Grass was dead beneath it, black and brittle. In the center of the circle sat a pine cone, large, almost unnaturally so. It was warm to the touch. When he brought it inside to examine it, it opened on its own, slowly, releasing a thick, metallic-smelling dust that made his eyes water. He bagged it, logged it, tried to radio for pickup. Static. That night, the knocking came again. This time it was on the back window. He didn't open it. He lay in bed, rifle across his chest, listening. The knocks came in 3s, sometimes minutes apart, sometimes from 2 sides of the cabin at once. There were no footsteps, no animal sounds, just the faint, slow knocks and the sound of something breathing, low and close, just beneath the floorboards. He didn't sleep. The next morning, he found boot prints in the snow around the station. Not his. Barely there, as if someone walked without putting weight down. They circled the cabin 12 times, then wandered off toward the northwest corner of the preserve, the old burn. He wasn't supposed to go there. It was marked off limits in every orientation. A controlled burn decades ago had cleared several acres, and the trees never regrew. Locals called it cursed. The forest avoided it. Birds flew around it. But something in Ellis said go. So he went. The old burn was still black, still lifeless. Charred stumps poked from the snow like rotten teeth. But in the center, there was something new. A ring of standing stones. 13, maybe more. Covered in moss despite the cold. Each was carved with something, a symbol, like a tree with too many branches, spiraling. The moment Ellis stepped into the circle, his GPS went dead. He heard whispering. Behind him. Inside and he backed away. Felt watched the whole way back to the station. That night, he dreamed again. This time he wasn't sleeping. He knew that. He was inside something wooden, breathing. Roots threaded through the walls. A figure stood in the corner, unmoving, face covered by a ranger hat. When it lifted its head, it had no mouth, no nose. Just eyes. Dozens of them, opening across its face like blisters. And it spoke not with words, but with memory. It showed Ellis things. The first Rangers in the 1920s. A patrol that never came back. Their bones fed to the roots. A creature older than the pines, buried beneath Black Hollow, growing, dreaming. Every 50 years, it woke up a little more. And now it was hungry. Ellis woke screaming, soaked in sweat, with a mouthful of dirt. He didn't sleep again. The snow kept melting in strange shapes. Circles, spirals. Once, a footprint, massive, three-toed, deeper than the snow should allow. He called in a distress beacon. The signal bounced back. He tried the emergency flare. It didn't ignite. Batteries fully charged. Nothing worked. Then the sky changed. He didn't notice at first, but over the course of 3 days, the stars moved. Not drifted, moved. Constellations spun into wrong shapes. Orion's belt curled. The moon pulsed. During the day, the sun was dim. No planes flew overhead anymore. No satellite signals. Even the birds were gone. And then came the whispers again, louder now, clearer. They came from the trees, from inside the wood of the cabin, from the ice in his glass. They told him his name in voices not quite human. They asked him to come outside. Not in anger, not a threat, a request. Like they were lonely. He boarded up the windows. He made a fire. He read his log over and over, like it might make sense of what was happening. On day 61, he stepped outside at dusk and saw a second cabin on the ridge, identical to his own. It hadn't been there before. Smoke came from the chimney. He walked toward it, rifle in hand. Inside was another version of him, slightly older, pale, hollow-eyed, sitting at the table, not moving, not breathing. When Ellis stepped in, the door slammed shut. He turned to look back and saw a forest where the door had been, and the figure at the table whispered, "You're next." He woke up outside his own station, but his logs were gone. His boots were dry, and there was a photograph pinned to the door, old, yellowed, showing 13 Rangers standing by the old burn. One of them was him. Smiling. It wasn't possible, but nothing was anymore. Now, the trees move even when there's no wind. The roots have breached the floorboards. He sees faces in the frost, always watching. The pine cone he bagged? It's grown. It pulses. He's out of food, out of time. When the next ranger comes next season, maybe they'll find this note scratched into the wall. Maybe they'll hear the knocks too. But they won't leave. The forest doesn't let them. It needs to grow. Story 4. It began with a missing map and a silence that grew thicker each morning, the way fog clings too long to the tree line and refuses to lift. And Ranger Alan Dorsey knew something was wrong the first night the owls didn't hoot. The first time he heard the rustling that didn't belong to deer or bear or wind. It moved like something dragging fingers across the pine needles, something curious, not hunting, not yet, but learning, in the station, deep in the preserve, far from town, with no cell, reception, and only a radio that squawked and hissed more than it spoke, started to feel like a box with thin walls and thinner air. And when the first claw marks appeared on the trees closest to the eastern perimeter, Alan logged it as a large cat. Though he'd never seen a bobcat stretch tall enough to slash 7 feet up, and the pattern was wrong, almost careful, 3 lines down, 2 across, like a twisted sigil scratched into bark, repeating every mile like a boundary, and at night hiss. Dreams stopped being dreams. They were reruns of other people's memories, hikers he'd never met walking into the woods, whispering to themselves, one of them crying before stepping into a hollow beneath the rocks. And each time Alan woke up choking on dirt that wasn't in his cabin the night before, dirt that smelled like rot and iron, and the animals stopped coming, the squirrels, the foxes, even the crows, all gone, and the forest was quiet in a way that felt aggressive, like it held its breath. Whenever he moved, like it was watching from behind every trunk. And then came the mimicry, the sounds of his voice calling from the woods when he was alone in the tower, repeating the last thing he'd said like a parrot learning language. Only it got the inflection wrong, too flat, too curious, too excited, and it started calling him not just by name, but by the name his mother used, the one he hadn't heard since childhood. And he found his own handwriting in the logbook recording entries he didn't remember writing, entries describing patrols he hadn't taken and incidents he never saw, including one about a creature made of bark and teeth and stretched skin that followed him at night, watching through windows it carved itself. And the logs ended each time with "Do not trust the next one," and then the ranger station changed subtly, though it a shade darker than before, The windows 1 inch too small, his boots not where he left them, his hat replaced with an older model with a badge from the 1930s, and he found a journal beneath the floorboards written in the same looping script he'd just seen in the log, but dated 1929, and the entries matched his thoughts exactly, word for word, including one he hadn't even said aloud yet. And when he touched the last page, his nose began to bleed, and he heard his mother's voice screaming from beneath the floor, and the forest began leaving gifts, dead animals with eyes intact, watches stopped at midnight, teeth wrapped in birch bark. A photograph of himself standing beside the tower, though no one else was within 20 miles, and on the back of the photo it read, "Keep watching the roots," and when he did, he saw them move, subtly at first, just a twitch, then curling like fingers. And he dug beneath the tower, found the hollow space, and the bones arranged in a circle with a pine cone in the center larger than his fist, pulsing with heat. And when he reached for it, the roots wrapped around his wrist and showed him a vision of the land before men, when the trees moved and breathed and needed worship. And he realized the park was not a preserve for humans, but for what came before. And he was the keeper not of nature, but of its cage, and the cage was cracking. And the thing that watched from under the earth was growing teeth again, and the knocking he heard every night was not from outside, but from the inside of the wood. And the message was clear now. He was to stay, become part of it, a ranger like the others who walked too deep and came back wrong. And when spring came, and the new ranger arrived, all they found was a tower with roots growing through the floor, a journal open to a final line scratched so deep it tore through the page, reading, "It learned my name, it wears my skin. It is waiting for you now." Story 5. They told Ranger Emmett Kerrigan that Deepwater Range was an off-grid post, low traffic, mostly weather observation, light wildlife patrols, and occasional radio check-ins. But what they didn't say, not in training, not in the paperwork, not even whispered in the back channels of Ranger forums, was that Deepwater wasn't a national forest anymore, but a kind of old scar in the land, carved into the bones of a mountain that didn't want to be settled. And as he drove past the rusted boundary signs, the forest on either side grew thicker than made sense, the trees impossibly tall, leaning subtly in as if conferring in secret, their trunks almost glistening like skin instead of bark. And he thought the silence was just isolation, the clean break he'd been craving. But by the second day, he noticed there were no birds, no squirrels, no signs of life outside the occasional gust of wind that smelled faintly of copper and rain even when the sky was clear and the ranger station was ancient, older than any he'd seen, logs petrified black, the windows warped, and there was a second story, locked from the outside with bolts that looked hand-forged. And when he radioed to report it, there was static, only static, and on the fourth night, he woke to the unmistakable sound of someone walking on the roof, slow and deliberate, pacing from corner to corner for hours without pause. Though when he checked the next morning, there wasn't a single print in the frost, not even his own anymore. And that's when the dream started. The first was a memory of him falling asleep in his mother's lap, except the lullaby was in a language he didn't know and her mouth moved too fast, her eyes open and unblinking the whole time. And when he woke, the dream followed him into waking with the sound of those same words being whispered beneath the floorboards, and each day brought something new. Footprints leading into the woods that sank too deep, too far apart to be human, all pointing inward, toward the base of Wolfjaw Ridge, where the trees grew so tightly together they looked like the ribs of a long-dead animal. And there were markings on them now, shallow carvings, thousands of them, symbols spiraling into each other. And when he photographed them, the images were blank, but the camera smelled like old meat after. And then he found the journal, tucked behind the water heater wrapped in a ranger jacket from 1971, full of the same symbols, pages crusted in something that looked like dried sap but smelled like blood, and each entry ended with the same line. "The forest is older than God," repeated until the pen broke through the page, and when he tried to burn the book it wouldn't catch. The flame curled away like the paper exhaled, and at night, The breathing started, not his own, not anyone's, just a deep, rhythmic inhale and exhale that came from all directions at once, vibrating the glass and making the station feel smaller and smaller, like it was being swallowed from the outside in. And he began forgetting things. What day it was, how long he'd been there, why his boots were muddy when he hadn't gone out, why his hands smelled like iron every morning. And then the copy of the station manual began to change, text rearranging itself overnight, new appendices forming, protocol for unnatural containment, phase shift considerations, auditory hallucination alignment. And he laughed at first, assumed he was cracking under the weight of too much isolation, until he opened the locked second floor. He found beneath his tongue one morning after a dream of being pulled underground by hands made of bark and smoke, and upstairs was not a room, but a stairwell spiraling down, impossibly far, carved from stone slick with moss, the walls etched with more of the symbols, pulsing dimly in rhythm with the breathing. And from below came the sound of roots snapping like tendons, of something turning over in its sleep. And he fled, slammed the door, tried to board it up, but the nails wouldn't hold. And from then on, the forest began reaching in, through cracks, under doors, tendrils of vine that twitched and flinched when cut. And he found his own face etched into the bark of a pine 10 miles away from the cabin, mouth open, screaming, with a hole bored through its forehead. And the animals began to return, but wrong. Deer with no eyes, coyotes with too many teeth, birds that screamed like babies before dropping dead mid-flight, and every now and then a man, or something shaped like a man, would stand at the tree line at dusk wearing the ranger uniform he lost in the wash, his movements half-second delayed, like watching himself through a mirror that hated him. And it smiled without lips and whispered, "We remember you." And the dreams became memories of things that hadn't happened yet, being dragged down those stairs, being part of the roots, seeing the surface from underneath as if he'd become one of the old growths himself. And then came the day the radio turned on by itself and broadcasted only laughter. His own, looped, layered, warped deeper with every cycle. And the logbook began to fill itself in a handwriting close to his, but older, more desperate. And it spoke of things burrowed too deep to name, of rangers buried alive in standing graves made of bark, still breathing, of the forest not as place but as mouth. And the tower became a tooth lodged in its gum. And finally he stopped eating, because the food spoiled. Instantly, the cans full of wriggling roots. The water tasted like something's breath, and he stopped sleeping, because the dreams now hurt, left bruises. And when he finally made the hike to the helipad, he found the helicopter rusted through, mossed over, no blades, no call sign, and inside was another body wearing his own jacket, decayed down to bone, but with fresh blood on its hands and a message carved into the chest: "You never left." And so he turned back to the station, because where else could he go? And when he got there, the windows were gone. The door was open, and the tower blinked once as if waking. And when he stepped inside, the walls were bark, and the air was soil, and the floor pulsed, and the stairwell was open again and calling. And he knew he would walk down this time, because it was the only way to remember what he was before he was born, to understand what had always waited beneath the mountain. Hungry, dreaming, patient. And when the spring thaw came, and the new ranger flew in, she found a tower of moss and root, and a uniform folded neatly at the base of a tree with bark still wet. And when she turned to leave, the wind whispered her name and asked, kindly, if she planned to stay. Story 6. They always say the forest breathes at night, but they don't tell you that sometimes it breathes wrong. Like a thing remembering how to live again after centuries of stillness and silence. And I didn't believe any of that crap before I became a ranger at Elkvale National Preserve, which was supposed to be this pristine, scenic patch of remote land out in the Pacific Northwest with moss-thick pines and glacial lakes. And no cell service. No towns for 40 miles, just me and the elements and Radio that crackled more than it spoke, and I liked it that way. I really did. The solitude, the peace, until that one night shift in October when I took over the watchtower from Parker. He looked pale, sweaty, said he wasn't sleeping right, kept hearing whimpering noises from the tree line. Thought it was foxes or something else small and scared, but I could tell he wasn't buying that even as he said it, and I made the mistake of laughing. Told him it was probably just his nerves, the isolation messing with his head. But now I wish I'd listened. I wish I'd noticed the smell coming off him, like old leaves and wet copper. I wish I'd asked him about the strange shape in the sketch pad he left behind in the watchtower. Pages filled with spirals that grew arms and legs and teeth the deeper you looked. And I wish I'd paid attention to how he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the trees. The trees that had grown a little too thick that season, creeping closer to the tower then. I remembered, but that night I settled in with my thermos and binoculars and notebook, flipping through reports of minor trail closures and storm damage. Nothing serious. Nothing weird until exactly 1:13 a.m. when the radio gave out a burst of static followed by a voice that wasn't mine. Wasn't Parker's. Wasn't anyone I recognized. It said he's in the roots now. And then the radio went dead. Just a dead channel like the air itself was holding its breath. And when I looked out over the forest, I swear to God every tree had shifted just slightly, like they'd taken a step forward while I blinked. And I sat frozen for a long time thinking it was just a trick of the wind, the moonlight, until something knocked at the base of the tower. Not like a bear or a raccoon or a branch in the breeze, but 3 clear raps. Knock, knock, knock. And when I called out, there was no reply, just the smell again, that same coppery rot, and the creaking groan of the metal staircase as something started climbing up. But when I leaned out the window with my flashlight, I saw nothing, no movement, no shadows, just empty steps, until I turned back into the tower and saw the spiral, Parker's spiral, drawn huge across the wall behind the equipment rack, etched into the wood with long, deep grooves like claws or bone. And it was wet, still dripping, and I didn't know what to do, so I ran down the stairs into the woods like a fool, like a deer. No weapon, no plan, just blind panic, and the trees seemed to part for me at first, like they were letting me in, ushering me towards something older than the forest itself, something that made the air pulse and my ears ring and my breath catch in my throat. Until I came to the old ranger cabin at the northern boundary, the one nobody used anymore since the landslide cut off the trail, but the door was open and candlelight flickered inside, and I stepped in and saw Parker, or something that had been Parker, sitting in the center of the floor with roots growing out of his arms, his mouth open too wide and filled with dirt, his eyes milky like river stones, and his voice didn't come from his throat, but from everywhere, like the wind and the trees and the floorboards were speaking through him. And it said the forest remembers its keepers and the spiral opens downward. And then his body collapsed inward like a dying flower, folding and breaking and splitting until all that was left was a pile of damp soil and teeth. And the candles went out and I felt hands, dozens of cold soft fingers, brush my shoulders and neck and back, guiding me down through the floor. And I fell into the roots, not just into the ground, but into something beneath the ground, a vast hollow breathing space filled with twitching wood and sighing bark and endless soft whispers that said things I can't unhear, secrets in a language older than time that burned themselves into my skull. And I don't know how long I was there, hours or days or years, until I woke back in the watchtower at dawn with my notebook open and the page filled with spirals I don't remember drawing, my clothes damp and smelling of moss and blood, my boots full of mud and something wriggling I never found. And I tried to call it in, tried to tell someone, but the radio just spat static and the phone line was dead. And when I hiked out to the ranger station, I found it empty, like it had been deserted for months, windows broken, everything covered in dust and vines, and the trail signs were gone, the maps missing, like the forest had erased itself from the world. And now every night I hear the knock, 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 Even if I move cabins, even if I hike 20 miles out to camp alone, I always hear it at 1:13 a.m., always from the edge of the dark, and I know if I open the door I'll see the spiral again, not carved but growing, curling like a fern from the mouth of someone I once knew. And I know that the forest never let me go. It just let me leave, and I think every step I take just winds me deeper into its roots. And someday I'll wake up with moss in my lungs and my voice in the wind, and I'll be the one knocking. Story 7. They warned me when I took the post at Dead Ash Forest, warned me not with words, but with silences, sidelong glances, the way the hiring officer paused when he saw which side I'd been assigned to, how he cleared his throat and said, "You're gonna want to keep the radio close." And I thought it was just the isolation, just the loneliness that got into people's heads out there in the 58,000 acres of untouched wilderness where the trees grow twisted and the fog hangs low even in summer, where the soil is black and slick like old oil and the ravens don't scatter when you approach but stare like they're counting heartbeats. And I thought I could handle it. I've done backcountry rescue. I've patched up frostbitten hikers and carried bodies out of flooded canyons. But I wasn't ready for this, for the forest that grows too quietly, for the air that never stops whispering, for the way time runs different out there, slower and sticky like syrup in your ears, and it all started on my fourth night, just past 2 a.m., when I heard something over the radio that shouldn't have been possible, a voice, ragged, far away, crying, "Please. I've been down here for days," followed by a screech of static and then silence, total silence, not even bugs, not even wind, and I sat there frozen in the old fire watchtower, heart pounding, listening to the dark lean in around me until the call repeated again, exactly the same words, same pitch, same cadence, like a recording on loop, and I tried to radio back, tried to reach base, but all I got was a reply in a voice that sounded exactly like mine saying don't follow it, and then everything went dead again. And I sat there for a long time, watching the forest below through the thick windows, and I could swear the trees had moved. Just slightly, just enough to make the trail look different, and I should have stayed put. I should have waited until daylight. But I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, trying to triangulate the source of the call. Hiking through the dense dark toward where the voice had come from, thinking maybe someone had fallen into one of the old sinkholes or collapsed mine shafts that scatter the park like open mouths. And the deeper I went, the quieter everything became, until the sound of my own footsteps felt deafening. And then I saw it, a clearing I'd never seen on any map, ringed by burned tree stumps, and in the center, a ladder descending into the earth, slick with moss, too smooth to be natural, and I should have turned back. I know that now, but I was trained to help, trained to rescue. So I climbed down, and the ladder went deep, deeper than it should have, the walls around me getting warmer, damper, pulsing like flesh. And after what felt like hours, I reached the bottom and found myself in a tunnel that breathed. I swear to God it breathed. And it was there that I saw the others, the ones who'd gone missing from the park over the years, the lost hikers, the runaways, their eyes hollow. There, limbs bent wrong, their skin the color of bark, and they looked at me and spoke, but not in words, in memories, in feelings, in flashes of childhood birthdays and broken bones and dark water. And I understood that they weren't alive anymore. Not in the human sense, but not dead either, not gone. And they told me through thoughts that the forest wasn't just alive, but aware, ancient, older than bones and blood, and that it fed not on flesh but presence, on the idea of a person, on memory and will. And those who got lost weren't found because the forest unwrote them, pulled their threads loose and rewove them into roots and leaves and rot. And when I turned to climb back up the ladder, it was gone, just gone, as if it had never been there. And the tunnel started collapsing inward, the walls closing like lungs, and I ran, stumbling through dark that was too thick, like it was pushing back, like it wanted to keep me, until I found another opening, not the one I came through, but a break-in. The tunnel wall that led back into the forest, except not quite. The trees were too tall, the sky too low, and the stars blinked in patterns I didn't recognize, and everything was wrong, off by just enough to make my teeth ache and my skin itch. And I hiked for what felt like days, never seeing the sun, eating bark and moss and things that whispered in my hand, until I found the tower again, my tower. But it was old, overgrown, the paint peeled, the windows cracked, like decades had passed while I was gone. And when I climbed back up, I found a ranger sitting there, younger, scared, holding my radio, and I realized it was me, not quite me, a version of me, eyes blank, repeating that same line over and over, please. I've been down here for days. And I understood then that I never left, not really, that I'd become a thread in the spiral of the forest's memory, just one more echo in its endless chorus of lost things. And now I sit in the tower, watching hikers below who never look up. And sometimes I speak through the static, sometimes I whisper warnings, but they never listen. And I watch them vanish one by one into roots and ruin, and every once in a while one of them finds the clearing, finds the ladder, and I beg them not to climb down. But they never hear me, and the forest always welcomes them home. Story 8. They assigned me to Black Hollow Preserve after Ranger Ellis disappeared. Said it was probably exposure or a fall, or maybe he'd just walked off into the woods to clear his head and never came back. And when I asked if they'd searched, if they'd used dogs or a helicopter, my supervisor looked at me with that blank government smile and said we looked, but the forest can keep who it wants. And I laughed nervously like it was a joke. But he didn't, and now I know it wasn't. Now I know the woods around Black Hollow aren't just deep and wild and full of cliffs and caves and twisted roots. They're hungry. They're awake. They know your name before you say it, and they whisper it back to you in the sound of wind through pine needles and rain hitting canvas. And my first few days were normal enough. Quiet shifts, setting trail cameras, checking signs, logging minor rock slides and tree falls. But even then there were signs. Strange things that didn't feel strange until later, like how every path seemed to double back on itself no matter how far I walked, or how animals wouldn't go near certain clearings, or how I found a dozen dead birds arranged in a spiral near the East Trail. No blood, no wounds, just perfectly still like they'd dropped mid-flight in formation. And on the 5th night, I woke up in my cabin to the sound of something scratching on the walls from the outside. Not a bear, or a raccoon, or a branch in the wind, but long, deliberate scrapes, slow and steady like someone carving a name into the siding. And when I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, there was nothing, no prints, no movement, just the trees swaying gently like they were watching me breathe. And I looked back at the wall and saw a word scratched into the wood, letters jagged and deep. Come back. And I stared at it for a long time because it wasn't just a word. It was my handwriting. I swear it. Carved just like the notes I used to leave on Ellis's truck before we'd split up on patrol. And I remember thinking maybe it was a prank, some sick joke by another ranger. But none of them came near Black Hollow anymore. They handed off radios at the edge of the preserve like it was cursed. And when I asked around, no one would say anything directly. Just stories about the old-growth woods there, stories about trees that moved in voices in the fog, and people who came out with glassy eyes and no shadows. And I would have laughed a month ago. I really would have, but not now, not after the day I found the hatch, an old iron door half buried in moss at the edge of a dried-up creek bed. No markings, no path leading to it. And I stood over it for almost an hour before I pried it open and looked down into a black spiral staircase that disappeared into the earth, the air coming out like the breath of a dying thing, wet and warm and full of rot. And I don't know why I went down. Maybe because Ellis was still missing. Maybe because I felt pulled, like the door had opened inside me instead of the ground. And the steps went deeper than should have been possible, deeper than the base of the mountain itself. And the further I went, the louder it got. Not noise, exactly, but thoughts that weren't mine, images that filled my brain like smoke. People kneeling in a circle around a pulsing mound of roots, mouth sewn shut, eyes black and unblinking, and a woman in ranger gear screaming silently as the ground swallowed her whole. And when I reached the bottom, the walls were soft and lined with wet bark and something like veins pulsing beneath. And there in the center was Ellis, or something wearing his face, but it was too thin, too long. eyes too large and full of shimmering black sap, and it turned to look at me with a snap of bones and said it remembers you. And then the roots came alive, rose up from the floor and the walls and wrapped around me like fingers, pulling me into the earth, and I screamed and fought and somehow broke free, scrambled back up the spiral, the walls, closing behind me like a throat. And when I burst into the daylight, the hatch was gone, sealed with smooth moss like it had never opened. And I ran back to my cabin, locked the door, stayed up all night watching the woods. And at 3:17 a.m. the radio crackled on with Ellis's voice saying you were supposed to stay. And then the door creaked open, slowly, on its own, and the fog rolled in, thick and cold and full of shapes. Figures that pressed against the glass like wet paper dolls, mouths open, eyes hollow. And I shut off the lights and held my breath and didn't move. And by dawn they were gone, but the word comeback was carved into every tree within sight. Hundreds of them, bleeding black sap. And I filed a report, tried to call it in, but the signal dropped, and when I drove out to the nearest outpost, all I found was a building full of mold and empty chairs and a calendar from 1983. And I don't think anyone's out there anymore. Not in the way I remember, because when I checked it, logbooks, they've rewritten themselves, the ink bleeding into new names, new dates, like time is bending or being eaten. And now I hear tapping in the walls at night, footsteps on the roof, whispers from the chimney saying things I haven't told anyone since I was a kid, secrets I buried deep. And I know the forest knows. I know it's inside me now, curling around my spine like a vine. And I think soon I'll walk out into the trees and I won't come back. Not because I'm lost, but because I'll belong to it. I'll fit, like a missing tooth sliding into the gums of something old and hungry. And when the next ranger comes to replace me, they'll find my handwriting on the walls, my voice on the radio. And they'll go looking, and they'll find the hatch, and it'll open, and the forest will remember them too.
Story 9. They don't send people out to Red Vale anymore unless they don't care if they come back or unless they're running from something worse, which is how I ended up stationed in a ranger tower 50 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by an expanse of rust-colored pines that never shed needles, trees that leaned ever so slightly inward like they were listening. And I took the job because it was either this or letting what happened in Yosemite follow me forever. So I packed up, drove in silence, and accepted the keys from a man who never once looked me in the eyes, who only said, "Don't leave the tower after sundown," before driving off fast, without saying goodbye or even checking if the gas pump worked. And for the first week it was mostly silence and wind. Checking trail markers that weren't where the map said they should be, picking up trash from campsites that no one registered, and filling out reports that always came back with a single stamped word, archived. But on the 8th night the radio picked up a signal around 1:43 a.m., a voice whispering low and soft, like someone had buried the mic under a pillow and was still trying to speak clearly. And what I heard was my own name, again and again, drawn out like it hurt to say. And when I tried to respond, all I got was static in a high-pitched tone that made my fillings buzz and my nose bleed. And then nothing. So I told myself it was interference, maybe a prank or a frequency bleed from the nearby Air Force base. But I still couldn't sleep, not with the pine shadows crawling up the walls and the feeling that something just outside the window was watching, breathing slow, matching the rise and fall of my own chest. And the next morning I found that every tree in the half-mile radius around the tower had thin red slashes on the trunks, like claw marks or symbols, too straight to be natural. And they weren't there the day before, and when I radioed it and I got no answer. Not even static, just that long silence. That sounds too much like listening, and it got worse the next night, because something knocked on the tower door 3 times, slow and deliberate, not like an animal, and when I looked through the peephole there was no one. Just fog and pine needles stuck to the glass like fingers, and that's when I heard a second knock behind me on the inside of the cabin closet. And I didn't open it. I didn't move. I just sat with the light off until morning, gripping the flare gun like it could actually protect me. And in the daylight it all looked normal. No fog, no scratches, no signs of entry, except for one thing, my boots. which I'd left by the bed, were now outside the tower, neatly placed side by side facing the woods. And the laces were tied in a knot I didn't know how to make. And I told myself I was sleepwalking, maybe dreaming. But every night after that the forest grew louder, groaning like an old ship, creaking like wood under weight. And on the 12th night I woke up on the floor, with dirt in my mouth and pine needles tangled in my hair, and the logbook open beside me with a message written in my own handwriting that I don't remember writing, dig where the roots burn. And so I did. I hiked out to a clearing where the trees leaned farthest inward, and the smell there was sweet and wrong, like rotting fruit and iron. And I started digging with a folding shovel, deeper and deeper until I found bones, small at first, animal, I thought. But deeper still I found a human jaw, no, flesh, just perfect teeth locked in a grin and roots growing through the sockets. And when I pulled it up the ground screamed, not in sound but in pressure, like something shifting beneath the soil had felt me, had noticed. And I ran back to the tower but found that the path had changed, as if the forest had tilted slightly while I wasn't looking, and every trail marker now pointed inward instead of out. And when I finally got back, exhausted and shaking, the tower was covered in pine needles. That spelled my name, and the door was open, and the closet door was open too, and inside was a staircase that hadn't been there before, narrow and spiraling downward into dark red light. And I should have called for help, should have run, but I didn't. I walked down those steps because I had to know, because my name had been whispered in the wind for nights now, and I felt like I had already been chosen, and the steps went deep, deeper than the land should allow, winding down through stone that wept sap and echoed heartbeats, and at the bottom was a cavern filled with tree roots like veins, glowing faintly, and something in the center, huge and breathing, pulsing slowly. A mass of wood and flesh and bone with antlers made of twisted limbs and eyes that didn't blink but saw everything, and it spoke, not with a voice but with a presence in my spine, in my teeth, saying I had come home, that all rangers eventually came home, that I had been watched since before I was born, and that the forest remembers all who tread its paths. And I saw Ellis there too, half swallowed by the roots, his body part bark and part man, eyes open but empty, and he said, "You can't leave now, not after what you've seen." And I screamed, but no sound came out. And the thing reached toward me with a root tipped in fingernails of memory and touched my chest. And I woke up back in the tower with pine needles in my mouth and soil under my nails. And the stairs were gone, but the door was open, always open, now. And the radio only plays my own voice calling for help on a loop I never recorded. And sometimes I see myself walking in the woods below, just out of reach, waving back at the tower, and the logbook writes itself now. Messages I don't remember making, like leave the door open and they'll send another soon. And I know what's coming. I know I won't last much longer because I can feel the roots in me now, growing slow and soft through my thoughts. And every night I dream of the red light and the breathing bark and the choice, except it's not really a choice, is it? It never was. And soon I'll walk into the trees without my boots and without my name, and I'll become part of the soil that watches and listens. And when they send the next ranger out, I'll knock on their door, slow and gentle, and ask if they remember me, ask if they'll dig, and the forest will wait with me. Story 10. They never told me that High Hollow had a history, not the kind that gets written down anyway. And when I signed on as seasonal night ranger, I thought I was just stepping away from city noise and burnout for a while, not walking into the hungry shadow of a place that remembers more than it should. Because when I first arrived, there were no signs of anything strange, just dense redwoods so tall the sky looked like a rumor, a crooked fire tower leaning like a broken tooth over the valley, and a network of trails that wove through the forest like scars that didn't heal right. But the silence was immediate, heavy, like a pressure on my chest that deepened at night when the trees didn't creak and the wind didn't move and the insects didn't dare to hum. And my first week was quiet, just paperwork and basic patrols, until I started to notice little wrong things like trail signs pointing in opposite directions on different nights. Markers with unfamiliar glyphs etched into the wood grain. Not painted or carved, but grown there like the trees themselves were remembering something. And it wasn't until I found a hiker's backpack outside the perimeter fence, sliced clean down the middle, contents laid out in a perfect spiral with pine cones at the ends, that I started to wonder if the forest wanted to be left alone. But the real shift came on the 14th night, when the fog rolled in not from the valley, but from beneath the trees, seeping upward like breath from a buried thing. And that was the first night I saw the lights, pale, flickering, and too far off the trails to be lanterns or other rangers, floating like will-o'-the-wisps through the branches and vanishing whenever I tried to radio them in. And after that the dreams began, not mine, but someone else's, memories of narrow stone rooms and chants and languages that left a taste of copper in my mouth when I woke up screaming. And every morning after those dreams I'd find my boots muddy, as though I'd been walking, and pine needles under my nails. And once I woke up in the lookout tower's upper level with no memory of climbing the stairs and pages torn from the ranger log stuffed into my pockets, pages I hadn't written, filled with looping script and frantic sketches of trees growing upside down and hollow men hanging from antlers. And when I burned the pages they screamed. I swear to God they screamed. And the next day, I found my face carved into the bark of a redwood that hadn't been there the day before. And the carving was smiling, even though I hadn't smiled in days, and things escalated after that, because animals started avoiding the area entirely. No birds, no deer, not even squirrels. And the only sounds I'd hear on night patrols were whispering voices behind the trees, not in any direction I could pinpoint, just there, in the air, like the forest was talking through its teeth. And I kept getting calls on the tower radio. Static at first, then fragments of sentences like, "It's under the roots," or "Don't let it wear your name." And once just, "You are not the first." And then the shadows started coming, not moving like people or animals, but sliding along the tree trunks in patterns too smooth to be natural. And on the 22nd night something knocked on the tower door, slow and deliberate. And when I looked out the window there was nothing. But when I opened the door, there was a dead elk standing upright on its hind legs, eyes missing and mouth sewn shut with something, fibrous and wet. And in its antlers hung my own uniform from the day before, torn and smeared with a thick black tar that smelled like rot and old breath. And after that I stopped sleeping, just sat in the tower with the lights on and every weapon I had in reach, watching the tree lean for motion that never came but always felt like it would. And then I found the pit. Not a sinkhole or landslide, but a deliberate hole cut deep into the earth, lined with smooth stone and etched with the same spiraling patterns I'd seen in the log pages. And it hummed, not audibly, but inside my teeth, a low vibration like a forgotten voice trying to crawl out of me. And I swear the pit breathed, pulling the air toward it in slow pulses like lungs beneath the soil. And I threw a flare in, and it didn't hit bottom, just kept falling into the dark until the red light winked out like it had been swallowed. And later that night the lights came again, closer this time, hovering just outside the tower, like fireflies watching through the glass. And when I woke up, if I ever even slept, I found my reflection missing from the tower mirror, just empty space where my face should be. And when I reached out, the glass was warm, and when I touched it, it pulled, and for a moment I felt my hand stretching away from me like it belonged to someone else. And that night the voices said my full name again, every syllable in perfect cadence, and said, "It has been waiting for you." And I remembered something. From orientation, something no one ever said out loud, but was whispered over beers after hours, that every 50 years or so, a ranger just vanishes from High Hollow. No trace, no body, no record, and a week later a new one shows up with a different name, but the same face. And now I think I know why. Because the forest doesn't just remember, it records, and sometimes it rewinds. And I've started seeing a second tower from the East Ridge, identical to mine, but half buried in ivy and earth. And when I hiked to it, I found a skeleton still wearing a uniform like mine, its hand clutching a broken radio, and its jaw stretched open like it had died screaming. And the name tag said my name, and I ran back, and when I turned to look again, the tower was gone. Just trees and fog and silence. And now I hear scratching inside the walls of my own tower, soft and methodical, like something carving new pages into the wood. And the logbook fills itself every morning with writing I don't remember. Making stories of people I've never met, places that don't exist, and warnings in a language I think I'm beginning to understand. And the lights are closer now, less like fireflies and more like eyes. And the last time I checked the mirror, my reflection spoke, said, "You're already inside." And I feel it now, under my skin, a pressure, a memory, like something old is wearing me, testing me, practicing how to speak through my mouth. And I can't leave, not because I'm trapped, but because there's nowhere to go, because the forest stretches forever now in every direction and the roads just loop like veins feeding back into the same rotten heart. And I think maybe I was never real at all. Maybe I'm just the next voice the forest needs to tell its story. The next ghost in a tower that doesn't show up on any map. And I know tonight the lights will come all the way in, and the scratching will stop, and I'll open the door, and something will step inside wearing my eyes, and I'll vanish like the others, another name forgotten, another story burned into bark, waiting for the next ranger to read it. Story 11. They say Black Hollow Gorge was closed off for safety reasons after the old mine collapsed in on itself back in the 50s, burying 3 workers and sealing off half the cave system under the southern slope, but nobody ever talks about what really happened. Not even in the ranger logs. And I know that because when I got transferred there for solitary overwatch during the off-season, just a temporary thing while they reassigned staff from a wildfire unit, the supervisor pulled me aside before, handing over the keys to the outpost, and said flatly, "Don't go near the mine entrance and don't answer anything that calls from the trees." And I laughed because I thought it was one of those dumb local rituals like watch out for the go-man or don't feed the fog. But when I got out there and found the mine trail chained and overgrown and the gate half melted like it had been sprayed with acid or something way too hot, I stopped laughing, especially because even though the mine was sealed, I kept finding fresh footprints in the silt around it, barefoot ones, narrow and long and always facing the entrance like they were waiting. And my first 3 nights in the ranger station were quiet except for the usual coyote howls, owls, wind in the trees, all the textbook wilderness background noise. But on the 4th night, I heard the tapping for distinct knocks on the cabin wall just after midnight, slow and spaced like it was thinking between each one. And when I rushed out with my flashlight, there was nothing, no tracks, no movement, not even a breeze. But I noticed the tree line looked different, denser maybe, like the trees had moved closer. And over the next few days, I started seeing figures in the distance. Never more than a silhouette just beyond the reach of my binoculars, always standing still and always gone by the time I got closer. And I told myself it was just shadows and nerves, maybe some leftover trauma from the flood rescue I barely made it through last spring. But the radios kept glitching, not just static, but bursts of audio I didn't recognize, low guttural moaning or whispered phrases in a voice that sounded like mine but distorted like it had been recorded underwater. And when I rewound the logs, they weren't there anymore, just blank silence, like the signals were only meant for me in real time. And then the cave started opening, not all at once, but slowly, like it was breathing. Like the rocks around the old mine entrance were shifting and sloughing off layer by layer and exposing more black behind it than could possibly fit in that tunnel. And the footprints came back too, more of them this time, circling the cabin at night in long, careful loops. And every morning I'd find strange objects on my porch. Bundles of animal bones tied with wet leather, feathers dipped in a substance like tar, pine cones split open and stuffed with teeth that didn't look human or animal. And I stopped sleeping by the 6th night, just sat by the window, with my rifle and my flashlight and a bottle of something stronger than coffee, watching the tree line warp and buckle like something massive was moving just behind it. And then came the voices, at first just one, a man's maybe, soft and calm and saying things like, "We've been waiting," or "You're almost ready." But then others joined in, different voices layered and overlapping like a choir being tuned by a blind conductor, all calling my name and offering pieces of memories that weren't mine. Like they were trying to make me forget who I was by giving me someone else's life. And I tried to leave on day 10, packed the truck, and hit the only road that leads down the mountain. But 30 minutes into the drive, I saw the same fallen log in the road I'd passed at the beginning, same tire tracks, same squirrel carcass, and I realized I hadn't gone anywhere, just looped back without noticing, and when I turned around to head back to the station, it was already dark, and I don't mean twilight. I mean pitch black. No sun, no stars, just a curtain of void so thick even the headlights barely reached past the hood. And when I finally pulled in, the cabin door was open even though I'd locked it tight, and inside everything had been rearranged. Not tossed or vandalized, but reorganized with an intelligence that terrified me. Silverware sorted by length and age, pages torn from the Ranger manual stacked in spirals, and a long smear of muddy footprints across the ceiling, like someone or something had walked up there calmly and deliberately while I was gone. And when I looked outside, I saw movement by the mine entrance, first a glimmer, then two glowing shapes that looked like eyes but weren't, and then a figure stepped out, impossibly tall. Not walking, but unfolding from the shadows like a spider peeling itself out of its web, and I couldn't look at it directly. My eyes slid off it like oil on glass, but I felt it watching me, and I heard my own voice from its direction, calling gently, like a parent cooing to a baby, and my legs moved on their own, just a few steps before I caught myself, and I locked the cabin and stayed inside until dawn, even though dawn didn't come that day. Just a pale gray dimness like someone smeared ash over the sun, and then I got the second warning written in charcoal across the cabin mirror. You were inside it, and that's when I realized the mine wasn't a tunnel, it was a mouth, and the forest wasn't a place. It was a thing, a single living organism with roots that think and caves that breathe, and a hunger for people like me who show up alone and already half broken. And I dug through the old records and found something dated 1923. An unsent letter from a surveyor named Delaney who talked about a hollow beneath the hollow, and the mimic men who take your face before they wear it, and how he'd seen a second version of himself walking into the woods at night. And the last line just said, "I think I've already gone." And now I'm starting to understand what he meant, because last night I found a copy of my own Ranger ID nailed to a tree, but the photo was wrong. My face was bloated and too pale and smiling too wide. And the name under it wasn't mine, but one I recognized from the 1953 collapse victims, and I haven't been able to see my reflection for 2 days now, just a deep static smear where my head should be. And the dreams have stopped because I think I'm not asleep anymore. Not really. And something speaks through the cave now, not in words, but vibrations that pass through the bones and gut. And every time I hear it, something inside me answers, and tonight the mine is fully open, not collapsed at all, but yawning wide like a throat mid-scream. And I can see figures moving inside, shifting behind the black like dancers behind a curtain, and I think they've been waiting for me specifically, like this was always my post and I just forgot it for a while. And I know I should be afraid. I am. Afraid, but it's mixed with something else now, something like belonging, like relief. And I wonder if that's the last thing the others felt before they stepped inside, because the cave doesn't echo, it swallows, and I've stopped fighting the loop, stopped checking the maps, stopped pretending there's a way out, because now the whispers are saying it's your turn to speak, and the wind isn't wind at all, it's breath, and I know tomorrow I'll go in, not out of fear, but because I have to, because there's a space inside that's shaped like me and it's waiting to be filled. Story 12. They assigned me to Coldwater Deep as a late-season emergency fill-in, just a 2-week overwatch in a glacial valley preserve way up past the tree line. A lonely string of cracked cabins and half-collapsed outbuildings tucked into a white void of ice and fog where the snow never melts and the wind never stops moving. A place that was decommissioned years ago after a fatal avalanche buried the trail crew and snapped the old Ranger Tower clean in half, but for reasons no one explained it was suddenly back in rotation, and I was the only one dumb or desperate enough to accept the post, figuring I could use the solitude, maybe process the mess I'd left behind downstate, an ugly divorce, a blown-out knee. and a missing hiker case from my last park that still haunted my dreams. And at first the silence felt like peace, like sanctuary, just long patrols on a snowmobile between iced-over lake crossings and frozen switchbacks, recording weather readings and checking perimeter cameras. But I knew something was wrong by the third night, not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. Because there were no animals at all, not even prints, and I don't mean scarce or shy. I mean zero movement in the snow, zero droppings, zero birds in the sky. Just a blank stretch of dead white and wind and an eerie pressure in my gut like I was being watched from underneath. And then the ice started singing, not like cracking or settling, but long, low harmonic vibrations rising up through the cabin floor in the middle of the night, so deep I felt them in my ribs instead of hearing them with my ears. And when I tried to report it to base, the satellite phone cut out every time I mentioned the sound. Not just static or dropped calls, but a grinding interference that left the taste of iron in my mouth and made my fillings ache. And the dreams began shortly after, strange, vivid, repeating ones where I was inside a tunnel of dark ice, walking toward a red light that pulsed like a heartbeat. And I'd always wake up with frost on my eyelashes and my boots already on, sometimes standing at the edge of the lake with no memory of getting there. And the footprints I left would be the only ones in the snow until the fifth night when I saw a second set, leading away from the door and circling the cabin before disappearing into the white, too wide apart to be human, almost like whatever left them had a gate not meant for this gravity, and the trail cams caught flickers that made my stomach drop. Not full figures, but shapes between frames, too tall, too narrow, no heat signatures, just a blur of pale limbs and what looked like a gaping face stretched vertical from neck to chest like an open wound. And the temperature dropped farther than it should have. Bottoming out at readings the instruments didn't register, and one morning I found the thermometer shattered and all the fuel tanks frozen solid even though they were insulated. And when I walked out onto the lake to check the ice, I found a circle carved into the surface, 10 feet wide and perfectly smooth, no tool marks, no cracks, just a glass-clear ring in the middle of the frozen expanse with symbols beneath it that looked almost like runes or veins, squirming faintly when I looked too long, and I swear I could see something moving down there, something slow and enormous and pulsing against the bottom of the ice like a buried heart, and the ice sang again that night, louder, deeper, almost melodic now. And I saw lights in the distance, dull red pinpricks hovering in the air like eyes, always in pairs, always blinking out when I tried to approach. And when I woke up after passing out from what I thought was a migraine, there were scratch marks on the inside of the windows. Deep gouges trailing down the glass like claws had tried to trace my face from the outside, and my reflection started lagging behind, not in mirrors, but in anything with a shine, pots, windows, the lake itself, and sometimes it would move when I didn't, tilting its head slowly like it was studying me or waiting for me to speak. And I started hearing whispers beneath the wind, curling through the floorboards and walls in a language that made my skin crawl. Not because I couldn't understand it, but because some part of me did, like it was speaking to my blood and not my brain. And then the drilling started, faint at first, like someone far below was scraping at the ice from underneath. And I remembered something from the old reports, something I read back in the ranger station before I flew out here, how the avalanche hadn't been caused by weather, how they'd found one of the crewmen half a mile from the slide zone with his jaw unhinged and eyes frozen wide in horror. Fingers snapped from scratching warnings into the ice that said, "Don't wake it," and "It sings to open the door." And I thought it was just trauma-fueled nonsense until I saw the door for myself, not one I could open, but one that appeared in the snow about 50 yards from the cabin, a black rectangle tall as a garage and outlined in flickering red symbols like the ones under the lake. And the wind stopped when I stood before it, the whole world going still and quiet as the ice sang again. This time in harmony with the wind chimes I didn't own and the pipes that shouldn't make music, and my own voice joined in, humming a tune I didn't know until it was halfway out of me. And I remembered things that weren't mine, memories of endless tunnels of black frost, of lights moving like blood through veins of ice, and of something waiting at the core of the glacier, something vast, formless, and ancient, dreaming beneath a crust of silence. And I started to realize the ice wasn't just thick, it was deep. unfathomably deep, a cap over a chasm older than the continents, and I wasn't the first ranger sent here, not even close, because I found their tags nailed to the bottom of the outbuilding doors, each one engraved with a different name but the same expiration date, always 12 days into the tour, and I was now on day 11, and I tried to leave, tried to fire up the snowmobile and bolt, but the engine was missing, just gone, as if it had never existed. And the tracks in the snow behind it were mine, but all facing toward the lake. And I finally understood what the dreams were showing me, not the future, but the past, not my own, but what it remembered, 1,000 eyes opening one by one beneath the ice, a mouth wide. Enough to swallow time itself yawning slowly toward the surface. And the whispers weren't trying to scare me, they were preparing me, training my thoughts to match the hum of the deep, to blend with its rhythm so I could be part of the opening. And I could feel the pressure under my skin now, something cold and ancient moving through my veins, rewriting me cell by cell like I was an instrument being tuned to play its music. And last night the door opened, not fast or loud but slow and silent, like a lid sliding off an eye, and behind it there was no tunnel, just a dark so thick and alive it swallowed light hole, and from inside stepped a copy of me, same clothes, same face, but its eyes were hollow and its smile was wrong, like it had too many teeth that changed shape when you blinked, and it walked right past me into the cabin, humming the song of the deep in perfect pitch, and when I tried to stop it I felt myself freeze, not with cold but with command, because it had taken my name, and now I was just something else, something outside, something waiting for another shell to wear, and the last thing I saw before I fled into the snow was my reflection in the lake, not looking back, but looking down into the depths, smiling with a mouth not made for speaking, and now I wander the white, not alive, not dead, but something in between, waiting for another ranger, another mind, another voice to teach the song, because the ice is not silent, and the cold is not dead, and something beneath it still stirs, slow and endless and dreaming in tongues older than stars, and I am only the first crack in the door. Story 13. They assigned me to Fogmere Coast as a summer relief ranger, said it'd be light work since the area wasn't heavily trafficked anymore. Mostly just a patch of ancient pine along a cliffside trail that hadn't been properly maintained in over a decade and only got the occasional coastal hiker or diehard birdwatcher who didn't mind the ocean winds trying to peel your skin off. And I took the job because I needed out of the city after what happened on my last post, found a camper buried upright in the marsh with her teeth pulled and eyes packed with soil, and I figured I could use the isolation, the salt air, a few weeks of mindless trail clearing and weather checks to forget what I kept seeing in my sleep. But Fogmere was wrong from the moment I arrived. Not wrong like hostile or dangerous, just off. Like a place trying too hard to pretend it was part of the natural world when everything about it felt staged, like the trees were standing too still or the wind was being faked by something that didn't understand how real wind moves. And the station was a converted lighthouse built on a bluff above the waves, and it moaned when I stepped inside, not with age, but with relief, like it had been holding its breath waiting for me to arrive. And the radio didn't work, only picked up a single channel that whispered in bursts of static like someone trying to talk through a mouthful of seawater. And there were logbooks here, dozens of them, none newer than 2006, all with the same notes scrawled on the final page in different handwriting. You can't leave until something replaces you. And I told myself it was a prank, a weird ranger tradition to freak out the new guy. But on the second night, I woke up to the foghorn going off even though the system had been decommissioned, and it kept blaring every 97 seconds on the dot. And between each blast I could swear I heard something breathing underneath it. Something wet and huge and deep-chested, like a bull exhaling. Under the ocean floor, and the fog rolled in thicker than I'd ever seen, not a veil but a wall, so dense I couldn't see the end of my own flashlight beam, and it smelled like brine and mold and something older than rot. And when I went to check the shoreline trail, I found pieces of rope nailed to the trees at shoulder height, worn and sun-bleached and frayed like they'd been tied around dozens of necks and then pulled apart over and over, and the trees themselves were carved with symbols I couldn't read, angular spirals and long vertical lines that bled sap in patterns like eyes or mouths. and when I touched one out of morbid curiosity, the bark was warm, and my ears filled with whispering I couldn't place, not English, not even language. Just the suggestion of words felt in the gut like nausea or grief, and every night after that the fog came closer, creeping in through the cracks in the wood and the seams around the windows, and I started waking up with seawater in my boots and salt crusted under my fingernails even though I hadn't left the bed, and the dreams began to stretch backward, showing me memories I didn't own, sailors tying stones to their legs, villagers singing while they sank, a child pointing into the fog and weeping blood while something rose behind her, too tall and thin and boneless, and the cliffs eroded and fast forward, whole chunks of coastline gone overnight with no wind and no rain. Just quiet collapses heard from miles away like the earth was sighing into the sea, and the sea itself felt wrong, not angry but aware, like it was watching with something buried far offshore that could think through the water and speak in tides. And I found a cellar door beneath the lighthouse hidden under a tarp weighted with driftwood. And when I opened it, the steps led not into a cellar but into an impossible drop, straight down into a spiral tunnel of stone carved with the same markings as the trees, descending through layers of fossilized teeth and coiled bones that didn't belong to anything that's ever lived on land. And the air was warm and moist and filled with the sound of many voices humming in unison, like a choir buried alive and still trying to praise something vast and cruel. And I didn't go far, just enough to know it was real, that it pulsed like a throat, that it wanted me to keep walking. And when I came back up the ladder, the sky was wrong black at noon, stars swirling like oil in water, and the moon had too many faces, all weeping or screaming or silent with mouths open so wide they split the sky, and the foghorn didn't stop now, not ever. And the whispering from the radio grew clearer, phrases like, "You've heard the song," and "Your bones remember," and I tried to call for evac. But the boat never came, and when I hiked the ridge trail to the highway, I just looped back to the lighthouse again and again, no matter which direction I took or how long I walked, and I passed other versions of myself on the trail, old and gray and barefoot with eyes like mirrors, and one of them whispered, "Don't become the mouth," before collapsing into driftwood and bones, and I began finding my own voice written in the sand, full sentences like diary entries I hadn't made, narrating things I hadn't done yet, like, "Today I will open the black door," and "I will give it my name," and my reflection in the window started lagging again, twitching and smiling when I wasn't, and it had gills opening along the sides of its throat, and barnacles spreading like birthmarks across its skin, and I knew something had replaced me or had always been me and was just waking up inside, and the logs in the lighthouse changed too, older now, backdated to the 1800s, and signed with my name in handwriting that matched mine perfectly, and they spoke of storms that never ended, and the day the sea stood still to listen to the prayers of the drowned, and the well in the clearing behind the lighthouse began to hum, even though it had no bucket, no rope, just water so black it reflected nothing, and when I leaned in close enough, I saw a version of myself crawling up from below, soaked and smiling and pulling something behind it on a leash made of hair, and I knew I was already sinking. Not into the water, but into the memory of this place, becoming one more piece of what it was, what it fed on, and I tried to burn the lighthouse, tried to light the signal oil and torch the structure, but the fire wouldn't catch, only dripped in. Slow green trails that hissed and turned to steam, and the steam spelled messages in the air like skywriting. "You are the light now, and the mouth must call." And I haven't slept in 3 days because every time I close my eyes I hear the chain dragging across the cellar stones and feel the wet hands wrapping around my ankles and smell the brine coming through the floorboards. And I think I understand now what Fogmere is. It's not a park or a forest or even a place. It's a mouth carved into the coastline of the world, a hunger shaped like land that takes whatever watches it too long. And I've begun to hum the same song as the foghorn, low and slow and circular, and I can't tell if I'm remembering it or inventing it or being taught. But I know one day someone else will be sent here, and I will be waiting in the fog, smiling wide with too many teeth and a rope in my hands, because the lighthouse never needed to warn ships, it needed to guide the willing into the dark. Story 14. They sent me to Station K. 22 up near Black Hollow Ridge where the tree line thins and the peaks knife into the sky like broken ribs because the last ranger station there had gone missing during a routine patrol 2 weeks prior, and I guess I drew the short straw, or maybe I just pissed off the wrong supervisor at the wrong time, but either way they dropped me in by chopper with a week's supply of food and a radio that only worked if I climbed the old fire lookout and leaned far over the edge. While holding the antenna at just the right angle and the wind-up there didn't feel like regular wind. It felt like breathing, slow and heavy like the mountain was asleep and dreaming something it wanted me to see. And the station itself was just a concrete bunker built into the side of a cliff, low and sunken with a rusted door that creaked like it hated to be opened, and inside it smelled of dust and blood and wet rocks. And I found the old ranger's journal on the cot still open to a page that just said, "Don't dig," over and over in increasingly frantic writing until the ink began to tear through the paper and soak the mattress beneath. And I thought maybe he'd had a breakdown, maybe the altitude messed with his mind. But then I started hearing the sounds at night, not animals or wind, but voices low and whispering just beneath the soil. And sometimes the rocks would shake in the fire it like something underneath was laughing or knocking. And I'd catch movement in the trees, too fast to be a person, too big to be a bear, more like shadows that bent in the wrong direction, tall and crooked and stiff-jointed like they were trying to remember how legs were supposed to move. And the pine needles began turning black near the station, curling and crisping like they'd been exposed to heat even though the nights were below freezing. And on the third night, I heard the hatch to the old mine creak open even though it had been sealed with 3 iron bars and padlocked when I arrived. And I hiked out to it with my light and sidearm, but there was no sign of forced entry, just the lock on the ground in a pool of something thick and dark that steamed even in the cold. And the door was ajar, just wide enough to slip through. And from inside, I heard the sound of rocks grinding on bone and a voice humming a song I didn't know, but my teeth ached with it like it had been drilled into me long ago. And I shut the hatch and walked back. But when I looked behind me, I saw boot prints in the snow that matched mine, except they were heading the other direction, deeper into the forest, and I started dreaming things I couldn't explain, like a river of teeth flowing through the valley or a tree that grew upside down from the sky, its roots reaching toward my heart like fingers made of frost. And I'd wake with cuts on my arms shaped like runes I couldn't read, but which I started seeing etched into the walls of the station and carved into the bark of trees along the eastern trail, the one the old ranger had marked "Do Not Follow" in the map drawer in red crayon like a child's warning. And there were other things too, like how the food began to rot before I opened it, or how the flashlight only worked when I wasn't pointing it at the mine, or how the radio stopped picking up static and started playing old emergency broadcasts that begged me to bury the stones and feed the mouths. And on the 6th day, I woke to find my boots filled with gravel and my fingers black with dirt, and my journal full of entries I didn't remember writing, pages describing ceremonies and names that sounded like broken glass in my mouth when I tried to say them aloud, and drawings of a figure with 6 arms and a head made of antlers and eyes, just eyes, dozens of them dripping like sap down its chest. And the more I stayed, the more I began to feel watched, not in the usual paranoid way, but in a focused, deliberate sense, like something was studying me from beneath, adjusting itself to match my weight, preparing a place for me inside the mountain. And the snow never melted even when the sun hit it, and the birds stopped coming, and even the wind seemed to avoid the station now, curling around it like a stream avoiding a corpse. And the mine door stayed closed, but sometimes I'd hear it breathing, not exhaling but inhaling, like it was drawing something in. And I remembered the ranger's last note, "Don't dig," and of course I did, not because I wanted to, but because the ground felt soft beneath my bunk, and I needed to know what was down there. And when I pulled up the floorboards, I found bones, not human or animal, but long and spiral-shaped like corkscrews made of ivory and hollow with holes down the sides like flutes. And they made music in the wind even when I tried to cover them, low moans that matched the rhythm of my heartbeat until I couldn't tell whether it was my pulse or the mountains. And I stopped sleeping after that because every time I closed my eyes I saw tunnels beneath tunnels, chambers pulsing with wet stone, and a throne carved into the roots of the earth with something vast and grinning sitting upon it, its arms outstretched as if waiting to be remembered. and I think I've been here before. I think I was sent here to return something I took a long time ago, something buried in the marrow of the mountain, because now the air hums when I breathe and the rocks whisper my name in a voice too old to be mine, and I see things moving under the ice. At night, long spindled limbs and a body like a centipede made of ribs, and I don't feel cold anymore. I just feel pulled, and the trees have started leaning toward the mine as if drawn by gravity or reverence. And last night the station door opened on its own, and I didn't close it because I saw the ranger standing there, the one who went missing, except he was taller now and his face was wrong, stretched like it had been poured over someone else's skull, and his eyes glowed like lanterns, and he whispered, "You woke it," before stepping backward into the trees, and I didn't follow, not yet. But I will. I know I will, because the roots are in me now, and the mountain is no longer asleep, and it's using me to call others. It's feeding through me like a straw through my spine, and when the next ranger comes, I'll leave the same warning in the journal. I'll try, but the dirt is so warm now, and the whispers feel like lullabies, and I think I've stopped being me already. I think I'm part of the thing that lives here, not a ranger, not a person, just a vein in the mountain's body, and it's almost time to open the mine again. Story 15. They stationed me in Dunlow Marsh because no one else wanted to take the fall season shift in a place where the sun sets behind fog-thick trees by 4 p.m., and the ground hums like it's holding in a scream, and the boardwalks twist just slightly more each week like the swamp is trying to curl back in on itself, and the other rangers say it's quiet out there. Too quiet. Good for those who want to disappear a while. So I packed up my field gear, my logbook, my rifle, and took the boat down the slow, tea-colored river into the thick, unmapped channels past the black willows that hang like drowned corpses, and when I arrived at the cabin, really more of a shack stitched together by time, lichen, and desperate maintenance, I found the last ranger's belongings still inside, boots dry but coated in thin green film, map open to a place labeled "No Sound," and the last note in the log simply read, "Don't listen when it's raining." And I laughed because rain was constant out here, a thin mist that drifted in like breath and soaked everything whether you noticed it or not. And on the first day I checked the perimeter, marked the new boundaries of the encroaching wetlands, flagged 3 sinkholes that hadn't been there in the satellite photos from 2 weeks ago, found a perfectly round patch of water that reflected nothing above it, no trees, no sky, just a black mirror, and I thought maybe the silt was too thick. Maybe it was an illusion, until I saw my reflection blink when I didn't. And I went back to the cabin and locked the door without thinking. Felt ridiculous afterward. But then the frogs began singing, not in the usual rhythm, not with chirps or croaks, but long, dragging vowels, all in the same note like some sick, gurgling chant. And the wind carried words, low and murmured, not in English, not in anything I'd ever heard before, and I slept with the lights on even though they flickered and buzzed like the air was too damp to carry electricity without protest. And the second night I heard footsteps around the cabin in the water, slow splashes, heavy and deliberate, not the scamper of raccoons or otters, but something taller, broader, and I peeked through the warped glass but saw only reeds bending away as if afraid. And the water there stilled like it was watching me back, and the power died sometime after midnight. But I didn't go out, not even with a flashlight, not even to piss, because I smelled something coming off the bayou I hadn't before, something old, like burnt roots and dead milk and rot deeper than death, rot with memory, and I started noticing the trees were changing, bark peeling in wide spiral patterns, sap that clung in thick, red ropes like veins spilling from cut skin. And I found one of the boundary flags shoved back into the mud the wrong way, pointing toward the cabin instead of away, and the little things began to happen. My boots filling with water I didn't step in, my socks tangled in reeds despite hanging inside, my coffee souring in the mug while I blinked, and every time I opened the cabin door, there were more footprints outside, heavy and bare and webbed like the skin had stretched too far and cracked. And on the 5th night, during the heaviest rain so far, I woke to the sound of humming, not human humming, but low and thick and layered, like something with too many throats gargling a lullaby, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside but under the floorboards, and I held still, breathing through my teeth, watching the old nails in the wood tremble with each note like the cabin itself wanted to dance or dig or split open. And when I finally moved to grab my flashlight, something under me knocked 3 times, slow and polite, like it knew I'd heard and was inviting me to listen closer. And the next morning the fog hadn't lifted, and I saw that the channel I came in on was gone, like the marsh had decided it was finished being part of the river. And I hiked the boardwalk trail and found that the planks had been rearranged, forming a spiral path inward instead of a straight loop. And when I tried to follow it, I walked for 2 hours without finding an end, just more cattails, more moss, more trees with names carved into them that I recognized from the ranger archives, people who'd worked this post and never left. And one tree had my name on it, freshly carved, sap still dripping, and I hadn't done it, hadn't told anyone where I'd be. And I ran back, or tried to, but the path folded again, tighter this time, like it was reeling me in. And when I finally reached the cabin again, hours later, there were handprints on the inside of the windows, too large to be mine, and smeared with algae that smelled like old rain and candle wax. And I tried the radio, but it only gave static that pulsed like a heartbeat. And when I screamed into it, something whispered back in a voice that sounded like my mother if she'd been drowned and buried for a decade, saying, "Lay down. The water is warm," and the generator stopped working for good. And the candles refused to burn, wicks curling away from the flame as if scared. And on the 7th night, I heard the boards outside creaking under weight again. And when I opened the door to confront whatever it was, I saw myself standing out in the rain, but not quite me, taller, swollen, eyes black and lidless, smiling with a mouth that reached too far down its cheeks. And it opened that mouth and poured out a frog, still singing that same vowel note as it landed in the water and vanished. And then it spoke, not aloud but inside my skull, saying, "We are the remembering mud." And I slammed the door and cried, real gut-heaving sobs, because I could feel something under my fingernails now, something wriggling, and the skin on my arms had started to web between the fingers. And I hadn't slept in days, but when I tried, I dreamt of the earth splitting and black water rushing up like a vein had burst, and everything in it was teeth and song and moss and old faces half consumed by hunger that wasn't hunger but something purer and deeper. And every time I blinked I'd see another image of myself beneath the surface, standing still, staring up, not waiting to be rescued but waiting to be let in. And when I finally broke the floorboards to see what was beneath, I didn't find mud or water or foundation, just a hole, a deep, round hole that pulsed like a throat and reeked like memory. And I think that's the worst part, how familiar it all feels now, like I've done this before, lived in this place and died and come back and done it again, over and over, a loop made of rot and reed and wet breath. And the longer I stay, the more I feel my bones softening, my thoughts dripping like algae through my teeth. And I know I won't leave because nothing leaves, not really. It just sinks and sings and joins the remembering, becomes part of the next story the swamp tells itself to stay alive. And tonight the rain is falling harder, and I've stopped trying to block the voices because they're mine now too. And I think the earth outside is ready to open, and I think I'm ready to walk barefoot into its mouth. And I think I've always belonged to this place and just forgot for a little while. But the land remembered, and now it's helping me remember too. Story 16. They said Elkspire Valley hadn't been mapped properly since the late 1800s, and that the trails were too twisted for satellite tracking, and the trees grew too tall for consistent radio contact, so most rangers didn't last more than a season out there, and that the last 3 had left early without giving notice or forwarding addresses. And I didn't care. I just needed to get away from people, from the noise and the grief and the city lights. So I took the assignment without question and hiked in, with a week's worth of supplies and a new logbook, expecting peace, solitude, maybe a few bear sightings and some weird cabin fever dreams. But from the first night something felt wrong. Like the forest was breathing just out of sync with me, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees as soon as the sun touched the ridge, and the trees didn't rustle so much as twitch, and the air smelled wrong. Not like pine or sap or soil, but like dried bones and mildew and old paper, like the pages of a forgotten book left in a flooded basement, and the ranger station was older than I expected, a sagging timber frame built against a granite slope, its windows warped and cloudy, its floors bowed like it had spent a century trying not to sink into the earth. And inside it was full of journals, old ones, dozens of them, each with a name scratched on the cover, most of them unreadable now, pages bloated with moisture, ink bled into veins across the yellowed sheets, but the legible parts repeated strange things, warnings and phrases that looked like scripture or spells. It listens when you speak its name, and the deeper path is not a trail, and never wake the hill. And on my second night the wind stopped completely and the silence pressed against the station like water against glass, and I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel outside, though no one should have been within 20 miles, and I peered through the window and saw nothing. But the steps kept circling until they stopped beneath the bedroom window, and something breathed against the wall, a slow low huffing like lungs made of dry moss and cracked bark. And when I opened the door the next morning, there were no tracks, no prints in the frost, just a pine cone placed neatly on the doormat. Its scales pried apart and filled with what looked like teeth, too small and too many, and I chalked it up to some animal I hadn't studied, tried to focus on my reports and patrols, but the woods didn't cooperate. Trails I marked would vanish overnight. Signs I posted were pulled down or nailed into different trees upside down, and the birds flew in perfect circles without landing, and the deer stood motionless between the trees watching me with eyes that didn't blink, and I started having dreams. Or maybe they weren't dreams, maybe they were memories I didn't know were mine, of standing in the woods at night while something moved underground, something that breathed so loud it shook the soil, something huge and buried and waiting. And each night the breathing got louder, and I'd wake with dirt under my fingernails and pine needles in my bed. And I tried to leave, packed up and hiked toward the trailhead, but ended up right back at the station 3 hours later, walking in from the wrong direction. And the trees didn't look right anymore. Their bark was smooth and black like wet leather, and they leaned toward me when I passed like they were listening, and I stopped keeping time because the sun started rising in the wrong place and the moon would hang low in the sky at noon. And I saw things between the trees, not animals, but shapes with too many joints and eyes like lanterns swinging in the fog. And one night I found a cave I didn't remember seeing before. Just a hole in the hillside sealed with a door of braided roots and bones, and from inside came a voice that sounded like mine, only older and broken, whispering that the ground was hollow and hungry. And I ran, but the trees bent toward me, tripping me, guiding me, and I fell into a creek that whispered in words I didn't understand, syllables like teeth on glass, and I started to lose pieces of myself, forgetting my name, my age, my life before this place, until all I knew was the forest and the weight of the thing beneath it, the thing that wanted me to stay and watch and wait. And I tried burning the journals, but the fire wouldn't catch, not even with fuel, like the words were protected. And when I tore out the pages, they grew back the next morning with new writing, descriptions of me in the third person, walking here, sleeping there, weeping in the dark, and I began hearing voices in the trees, not whispers, but full conversation spoken in tones I recognized. My father's voice telling me I'd never escape, my mother singing lullabies backward, my own voice laughing in a way I never had, and I saw faces in the bark, not carved but grown, mouths frozen mid-scream, eyes still wet, and the roots kept moving, tangling around my boots at night, pulling at the floorboards, creeping up the walls like veins, and I tried calling for help, but the radio only played static shaped like words, and then came the knocking, always 3 times, always under my bed. And when I finally looked, I saw a tunnel dug beneath the cabin lined with ribs and fur and hair, and it went deeper than light could reach, and I heard it calling me, not in words, but in hunger, and I knew I wouldn't leave, not because I couldn't, but because part of me wanted to. Know what it was, what lived under Elkspire, what the trees were feeding, what the other rangers had seen in their last moments, and I realized I was only the latest sacrifice, the newest set of eyes to record what couldn't be understood. And the thing under the hill was closer now, rising like heat, and the forest was folding in around me, the sky growing narrower each day, the air thick with spores and song. and I no longer need to eat or sleep. I just sit here listening to the roots, whispering the stories of every ranger who came before me, every soul trapped in bark and mud, and soon it will come, it will rise, and I will walk into its mouth with joy because there is nothing else, only the breathing, only the waiting, only the woods that remember everything and bury nothing. Story 17. They assigned me to Rye Hollow Preserve because no one else wanted to cover the high desert stretch after what happened last summer when the volunteer biologist went missing and they found his recorder buried 6 inches deep in cracked dirt, still playing the same 5 seconds of a scream that sounded like it was moving in reverse, and the audio technician who reviewed it gouged out his ears 3 days later and said it kept whispering something to him when he blinked, so the hollow sat empty for months. The trail maps removed from the website, the paths redacted, the airspace quietly restricted, but I didn't know any of that at first. They just said it was off-season, that no campers came through anymore. And I'd be alone for a couple weeks at the outpost on Dryvale Bluff to check seismic activity and weather monitors, basic stuff, no fuss. So I took the post because I was tired of people, tired of the city. And when I drove the service truck past the last gate and hit the unpaved, rode into the basin, I felt the heat hit like a second skin and saw nothing but rocks, thorn shrubs, skeletal ocotillo reaching like burned arms into sky, and it was beautiful, truly, in that brutal way deserts are. Until I reached the outpost and saw the door was already open and the wind inside the place had carved perfect lines in the dust on the floor, lines that curved like language, like brush strokes made by fingers that didn't end in nails. And the radio was on but playing only static. That cut in and out like a breathing pattern, and I thought maybe it was just the wind, because it howls here, it moves like water, tricking your ears, and for the first night I let it lull me to sleep. Until I woke in pitch dark and heard what sounded like pebbles tapping on the glass, soft and rhythmic, then harder, then louder, until one cracked the window and I jumped up and shone my flashlight out into the dark and saw nothing, not even my own shadow, which should have been cast across the scrub right in front of me, but it wasn't, and the air outside didn't feel cold or hot or anything. It felt like nothing, like touching the memory of air. And the second day I hiked out to check one of the old fire towers that was supposed to be sealed, but found the hatch open and the ladder scorched black, not burned, just singed like it had been flashed by heat so fast it didn't catch fire, and up top I found a single shoe, child-sized, and a feather that looked soaked in blood but felt dry, and cracked when I touched it, and I radioed it in but got no response, just that same breathing static, louder now, like someone exhaling right into the receiver, and when I hiked back I noticed the sun hadn't moved. It had hung just behind the clouds in the same position for hours, like it was waiting, and the shadows weren't right. They were stretching the wrong direction, not with the sun, but away from the ridges that made up the bowl of the hollow, like something under the ground was, drawing them inward. And that night I heard voices outside, not close, not loud, but like they were being carried on wind that wasn't blowing, and they weren't speaking English or Spanish or any language I knew, but I understood them. I understood the emotion of them, which was hunger and glee and pleading, like someone who'd been starving finally smelling blood, and I didn't sleep after that, just sat watching the horizon that never dimmed, and on the third day I stepped outside and realized I didn't cast a shadow anymore, not anywhere, not in morning or dusk, and that the outpost now had one extra chair in it, matching the rest but covered in a black dust that clung to the floor like it had grown there. And when I turned my back on it, I swear I heard it creak just once like someone shifting weight to stand, and the wind that night came from below, from the cracks in the rock, and it wasn't air, it was a sound, like dry fingers rustling pages that were never written in the monitor. Logs were wiped clean, all zeros, and my notebook pages began to bleed at the corners like paper that had soaked up meat drippings, and I tried leaving, packed my bag, drove until the road ran out. But the hollow doesn't let you leave once it sees you, once it weighs you, once it begins to mold you, and I ended up back at the outpost without realizing it, the sun still hanging in the same place like a frozen eye, and the voices were louder now, closer, saying my name in cadences I'd never heard. It in, breaking it up, stretching it out, making it sound ancient and brittle and holy, and I made the mistake of answering back. Just once, just whispered, "What do you want?" And the wind stopped. The whole desert stopped. And something answered by whispering from under the floor, from under the skin of the earth, and it said, "We want your shape." And I saw my shadow return then, only it wasn't doing what I did. It was standing still while I moved, and then it smiled. I swear to God it smiled. And I ran out into the salt flats and screamed until blood ran down my throat because the light started warping, folding, colors bleeding out of the sky like bruises, and I passed cairns I hadn't seen before. Little stacks of sun-bleached teeth and rusted wire with black feathers tied in twine, and I followed a path I didn't know but couldn't stop walking, and I reached a depression in the ground that looked like an eye socket big enough for a truck, and it was full of glass. Or something that looked like glass, with people beneath it, floating. Faces I recognized from the old personnel files, their eyes moving, blinking, screaming soundlessly in that crystal prison, and behind them, in the dark of that pit, something enormous breathing without lungs. A shape made of absence, of light too thick to be real, of hunger, and the glass cracked when I screamed and I ran again, not knowing where, until I reached the truck, and it was rusted over like it had been there years, and the radio was just humming my name on repeat. And now I stay here, not because I want to, but because there's no more road, no more sky, just this perfect light that never fades and shadows that curl at the edges like burnt film, and I know the hollow is changing me, unmaking the things inside me, replacing them with the hunger it needs, and I think the other rangers are still out there, walking, watching, listening, and one day I'll join them, shadow first, then skin, then soul, until I am only a part of the horizon that never ends, a piece of the heat that breathes, and I will speak in wind and sand and scream backward through stone, just like the ones before me. Story 18. They told me the Crooked Antler Preserve hadn't had a full-time ranger in 5 years, not since Ranger Hall disappeared back in 2019, and the incident was quietly swept under layers of administrative red tape and funding freeze excuses. And when I got the assignment, I didn't ask questions because I needed the isolation after what happened with my brother and the trial and the press. I needed trees and silence and distance from everything that reminded me I used to have a life. So I packed what I could fit in the back of my truck and drove 8 hours north until the roads turned to gravel, then rock, then vanished altogether. And the GPS started spinning in slow circles like a broken compass while the forest swallowed the sky in branches too thick to let any light bleed through properly. And when I finally found the old outpost, it looked abandoned, like no one had set foot there in years. But the dust wasn't as thick as it should have been. The bed was made. The logs had entries newer. Then the official reports claimed, and someone had nailed hundreds of feathers to the outside walls and spirals that ended in open-mouthed shapes like screaming birds. And the first few nights were uneventful except for the way the silence pressed into my ears so hard it started to feel like a second heartbeat, like something beneath the floorboards was echoing my pulse back to me half a second too late. And then came the first knocking. Not on the door, but on the trees, as if someone were using their fists to pound slowly on the bark out in the woods, same rhythm every time, 5 knocks, pause, for knocks, pause, 1 knock, always in that order. And when I stepped outside to investigate, there was nothing but cold air and the sharp scent of bark and moss and something else underneath it like rust and burnt hair. And I tried to tell myself it was just a woodpecker or frost cracking in the trunks, but then it happened again the next night, and then again, and always in a slightly different location, like something was moving closer to the outpost night by night, and the forest began to change in ways I couldn't track. Trails I marked vanished the next day. Landmarks like the split granite stone or the burnt-down watchtower would disappear and reappear miles away from where I first saw them, and the deeper I hiked, the more I began to hear voices, not loud, not even clear, but soft echoes calling out in tones I almost recognized, like a half-remembered lullaby or the cadence of my brother's voice right before he died. And once I turned quickly enough to see the outline of a figure standing behind a tree that was much too thin to hide a full-grown man, and it didn't run. It just leaned sideways to vanish behind the trunk in a motion too smooth, too fluid, like pouring oil into a crack. And the deeper I went, the more the trees began to lean toward me. Not much at first, just a few inches. But then one day I turned around and the path was gone and the trees had all shifted, actually shifted, their trunks bent in a spiral like they were growing toward a center I couldn't see. And the air began to taste sweet and wrong, like syrup and rotten copper. And I woke up with my boots full of pine needles and my hands covered in sap I don't remember touching. And then the scratching started, under the bed, inside the walls, like something was inside the cabin with me, nesting in the dark spaces where my flashlight couldn't reach. And the journal that had been blank when I arrived now had entries written in a handwriting that almost looked like mine, but not quite, letters crooked in strange ways, sentences that seemed fine until you read them twice and realized they were describing events that hadn't happened yet. Like, today I found the teeth in the snow, and don't answer the knock tonight. It's your brother, but it's not him anymore. And I tried burning the journal, but the pages refused to catch. Not even with fuel. The flames would twist away from the paper like it was repelling the fire. And then the thing under the cabin began to breathe, or at least I began to hear it breathing, deep and slow and wet, like lungs full of swamp water and leaves, and sometimes I could hear it muttering, not in English, but in some low chittering language that scratched at the back of my teeth like a memory I'd been forced to forget. And I stopped sleeping because every time I closed my eyes I dreamed of the forest floor folding open like a mouth and 1,000 antlers reaching up from the dirt to pull me down into wet, root-choked tunnels lined with the faces of every animal that ever died here, all of them twitching and murmuring in a constant prayer to something bigger and older than death. And I think I saw it once, while hiking north of Dead Elk Run, a shape standing between the trees that didn't have any space for it to be standing in, like it was just painted onto the air itself, with no depth and no motion until it turned to look at me, and its eyes weren't eyes at all, but hollow rings of bark filled with night. And I blacked out, woke up hours later with my compass needle spinning and every tree around me carved with the same spiral symbol over and over, thousands of times. So deep the trunk swept black sap that hissed when it touched the snow. And when I got back to the cabin, the feathers were gone from the walls, and in their place were hundreds of teeth nailed in the same spiral patterns, some of them human, some of them still red. And I tried to call for help, but the radio only played a recording of my voice on loop saying, "I found it, I found it, I found it." And I couldn't remember saying that. And when I listened closely, I realized it wasn't my voice. Just one that sounded almost exactly like mine, but too flat, too slow, like someone mimicking me from inside a jar of water. And now the knocking has stopped, but something new has started, a kind of singing, just outside the cabin, right after. Dusk, always in 3 voices, always in harmony, and the lyrics don't make sense, but they always end the same way, with, "We are the marrow in the mountain, and I saw my brother 2 nights ago," or at least something wearing his face, standing on the path near the tree line, smiling with too many teeth, eyes like empty bird nests, and it didn't say anything, just pointed down at the ground where the soil had cracked open into a hole shaped exactly like the cabin's floor plan. And I don't think I'm meant to leave. I think this place keeps what it needs, and it needed me, needed someone with a broken heart and a guilty soul and a face easy to copy. And I'm starting to forget the sound of my own voice, starting to move in rhythm with the knocks, waking up outside with dirt in my mouth and feathers in my hands. And sometimes I catch myself muttering in that same chittering language, and the trees echo it back, approving, answering, encouraging. And the outpost is sinking floorboards, groaning lower each night, walls bowing like they're being pulled underground by veins and roots and the long breath of the thing that lives beneath the preserve. And I know now that I was never assigned here. I was chosen by something that knew I would listen, knew I would break, knew I would stay. And it's almost ready now, almost awake, almost here. And I'll be the first to greet it with open arms and an empty chest and teeth carved into spirals. Because the forest never forgets its favorites, only waits for them to come home. Story 19. They told me the job would be easy, just temporary coverage at Cypress Hollow Refuge. A stretch of protected wetlands mostly forgotten by tourists and strangled by rising water levels after the hurricane rerouted half the river and left the park submerged 3 feet deeper than it used to be. And they said it was quiet out here, peaceful even. A good place to get my head straight and escape the noise after the incident at my last posting, the one where they found the fire tower melted down to. Its nails and my partner screaming in a language no one could identify. So I took the job, packed my gear, and drove down to the south station in a skiff they left me tethered near the road. Weaving through submerged trails and hollow cypress trunks that stuck out of the water like drowned fingers reaching for a sky that never seemed to shine the same way twice. And the first thing I noticed when I got there was the silence, no frogs, no crickets, no birds. Just the slap of stagnant water against the wooden supports of the visitor center, which had sunk so far down into the marsh that half the building was underwater, and my quarters were tilted just enough to make walking feel like I was always falling to the left. And I told myself it was fine, that the quiet was natural after a flood, that the animals would come back in time. But by the third night, I realized they weren't hiding. They were gone. Gone like they'd never been here, like something had erased them right out of the food chain. And in their place, I started hearing something else, something low and slow and wet, like something breathing just under the surface of the water that wrapped around the station like a moat, something that never quite surfaced but left ripples at random times. Perfect circles that spread out like signals, and it always happened between 2 and 3 a.m., and always followed by that same smell, like rotting fish and old iron, like something had died years ago and never stopped bleeding. And I tried telling the regional office, but the radio only worked during the day, and at night it just hummed, not with static, but with something that felt wrong, like it wasn't broken, just listening, waiting. Like someone on the other end was holding the button and breathing slowly through their teeth. And by the 5th day, I started finding things that didn't belong here, like children's shoes filled with mud, a wedding ring with teeth marks etched into the gold, and a deer skull with no antlers and a tongue still inside it, bloated and pale like a drowned worm. And I tried logging it all, but the park records had been gutted, pages torn out, computer drives wiped, filing cabinets filled with old waterlogged newspaper clippings about drownings. But not recent ones. These were from the 50s and 60s, each with the same headline: Boy missing after flood, local family vanishes in rising waters, search called off after divers pulled back empty, and always a photo of the same place, the boardwalk by the sunken oak tree near the bird blind, the same place where I saw ripples last night that didn't belong to any creature I've ever known, ripples that pulsed outward like a heartbeat. And when I went to investigate, I found the bird blind collapsed and covered in tiny handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the algae, and wood too small to be adult, too wrong to be child, fingers too long, palms narrow and webbed. And the prints led down into the water and stopped at a hole that hadn't been there yesterday, like the earth itself had opened its mouth, and I swear I heard whispering coming from it, not speech, just the suggestion of sound, like voices filtered through bubbles, too deep to reach, too familiar to ignore. And that night I had the dream again, the one that started on my second night here and came back every time I closed my eyes, where I'm standing in ankle-deep water in the visitor center and someone is knocking from underneath the floorboards. Slow, deliberate, 5 knocks, then 4, then 3, and I always wake up sweating, and now the knocking has started while I'm awake. Not every night, but close, always beneath me, always timed to when I'm trying to sleep. And last night, I left the recorder on, and when I played it back, there was something speaking under the knocks, slow and wet and slurred, saying you left the door open, over and over again, and I don't remember opening anything, but the trapdoor to the pump room was unlocked yesterday, and when I went down there, the water was higher than it should have been, almost up to the ceiling, and the pressure gauge had been shattered from the inside, and I saw something in the water, something pale and human-shaped with joints that bent wrong. And it didn't swim away when I shined my light. It just sank slowly, eyes open, mouth moving like it was reciting scripture to the dark, and when I surfaced I couldn't stop coughing, and the inside of my mouth tasted like rust, and my hands had webbing between the fingers for a full minute before it faded like it had never been there. And now I'm seeing things when I look into the floodplain, shapes under the lily pads, long and lean and too fast to follow. And I found the old ranger's journal tucked into a vent, pages stuck together with mold, and the last entry just said, "It only rises for the guilty," and that word keeps showing up now, in the mirror, in the window reflections, in the murk when I stir the water. It's always there, guilty, like something knows what happened with my brother in the trial and how I lied on the stand. And the worst part is I think the swamp forgives me, not because it's kind, but because it wants me. Wants to pull me into its lung-black heart and make me part of whatever it's building beneath the waterline. And I can feel it in my dreams now, not just knocking but crawling, something blind and soft and endless pushing through the mud like a fetus in reverse. And when I wake I'm soaked to the chest and the mattress is full of dead reeds, and I haven't eaten in 2 days because the food is full of bones I didn't put there, tiny vertebrae that click when I bite down. And I keep hearing a voice from the intercom at night that tells me to open the floodgates, to let the water finish what it started. And today the pressure gauge hit 0 and the last high ground has gone under. Even the old ranger shack on Stilts Point is halfway submerged, and the water is rising faster now, with no rain, no wind, just rising like the whole swamp is exhaling something it's held for decades. And I think it's me, or something wearing my face, because I've started seeing another version of myself walking between the drowned trees, staring at me with empty eyes, grinning, pointing down into the black. And it never speaks, just drips, just watches. And the final entry I wrote in the incident log wasn't mine, but it was in my handwriting, and it just said, "Do not rescue." And now I understand why the animals are gone and the water is never clear and the whispers are always louder underwater. Because this place doesn't keep secrets, it marinates them, ferments them, turns them into new skin, new mouths. And now I see how the flood was never an accident, never natural, just the first breath of something that needed to drown us all before it could walk. And tonight the knocking has become hammering, the water up to the baseboards, and the air smells like earth and rot. And I don't think I'll leave because I finally hear what it's saying between the knocks. The refuge was never for them. It was always for you. Story 20. They assigned me to Salado Dunes National Monument after 2 rangers went missing in under 6 months, and the reports stopped being filed, and the dust storms started coming from the wrong direction, sideways instead of head-on. Like the wind was no longer part of this world's weather system, but something deeper, older. And they told me I wouldn't be alone, that satellite monitoring and check-ins would be constant. But the truth is they sent me here alone. Just me and the cracked bones of a ranger station that hadn't seen pain in decades. And on my first day, the only sign of life was a vulture sitting on the roof with no eyes, sockets smooth and sealed like scar tissue. And I thought maybe it had some kind of birth defect until I found 3 more just like it roosting on the Firewatch Ridge, each one silent, unmoving, staring toward the salt flats like they were waiting for something. And I chalked it up to weird desert biology until I started seeing the footprints out there. They're human feet walking in patterns, spirals and figure eights too perfect to be random, too wrong to be art. And I followed one of the tracks for over a mile and they never wavered. Never detoured around rocks or cacti or even a dead jackrabbit that had been reduced to clean bones but still had its ears. And I should have left then, called in a report. But I didn't. Not until I found the first crack in the salt. A razor-thin fracture that bled red dust upward like the desert was hemorrhaging from beneath, and I watched it throb, pulse, widen just enough for something to breathe out of it, and I smelled copper and honey and old perfume, the kind your grandmother used to wear, and I remember my legs moving backward even as my eyes stayed locked to the crack. And that night I woke up with my boots filled with salt water and my hands stained yellow like pollen. And my mouth was full of something fibrous and soft that dissolved before I could spit it out. And I didn't dream that night. But I saw shapes under my eyelids anyway, silhouettes that didn't blink or move but pressed in closer with each breath I took. And the next day the air smelled different, not dry or sterile like before, but wet, electric. Like before a thunderstorm, except there were no clouds in the sky, just the same scorched blue stretching in all directions, and the heat wasn't normal anymore. It wasn't coming from the sun, it was radiating up from the ground. Like the desert itself had become a stove, and I took a core temp reading from a shaded dune, and it read 203 degrees and climbing. And that's when I noticed the shadows were gone. Not just mine, but the towers, the signs, the cliffs, even the vultures, which were still sitting in their exact positions but casting nothing. Like they weren't there at all, except I could hear their skin stretch when they turned their heads. And when I finally got a signal on the old radio, all I heard was a voice repeating, "One has been chosen. One has been chosen." And it wasn't my voice, but it was in my cadence, like someone had learned how I speak and stitched it into a loop. And I smashed the radio, but the message kept coming from my field recorder, then the fridge, then the goddamn electrical outlets. And the spiral tracks in the flats got wider, so wide they touched the outer dunes. And things started crawling from the center at night. Not people, not animals, just outlines of things that looked human until you looked too long and saw the joints bend backward and the necks crack sideways and the hands flutter like they were gills searching for water. And one of them watched me from 50 yards away for 4 straight hours, not moving, not blinking. And I went out there at sunrise and found a hole where it had stood, 6 feet deep, perfectly cylindrical, lined with quartz shards that reflected nothing. And in the distance I saw something tall walking through the heat shimmer, tall enough to touch the clouds that weren't there. And I heard singing then, not out loud but in my blood, in the tiny bones in my ears, a lullaby made from names I'd never told anyone. And I finally broke into the Ranger archive, the one they padlocked shut with a chain and a sign that said "Do not open." Seismic instability, and inside were maps dating back to 1912, all redacted except for one note in pencil on the back of a photograph. The desert remembers its womb, and I don't know what that means, but it makes me feel small, like I was born yesterday, and the ground under me is older than thought, and the salt flats keep cracking wider and deeper, and I threw a GPS beacon down one of the holes, and it fell for 23 seconds before the signal cut out and the last ping showed it still falling. Not vertically, but curving inward like the desert had teeth and the salt was just dried spit. And I tried to leave, drove north until my compass started spinning and my engine flooded with something that looked like blood but evaporated into dust when I touched it, and the vultures finally flew last night. But they flew upside down in a circle over my station and made no sound except a long hiss that raised blisters on my skin. And this morning there were people here, or something that looked like them. Old uniforms, badges from the 1960s, faces that looked waterlogged and smiling too hard. And they walked into the salt flat cracks and didn't come out. And now the spirals are glowing faintly under moonlight, and I think I saw my own face pressed into the crust of the salt, eyes open, mouth full of thorns, whispering my name backward, and my hands don't feel like mine anymore. The bones clicking differently when I type, and I can smell the same perfume again. And I think I've been breathing in spores that carry memory, not mine, but something buried and feminine and vast. And she wants me to know that the desert isn't dry. It's just waiting to break water, and the spirals are birth canals, and the singing is her labor cry, and I am the midwife and the child and the afterbirth all in one. And tonight I heard a door open underground, and now everything is too quiet again. Not peaceful, but paused, like the whole world is holding its breath for the next crack. And when it comes, I think I'll fall in smiling, not because I want to, but because she already remembers me.